Messiah, ndikuqingetolo phambi kwakho ndiyakhala simakade siyaphela olela ungasilahli ngeli xesha elijena El Shaddai Adonai thathelela ndiyacela olela
Sanibonani, Dumelang, South Africans. This is the Human in It, the show you've been waiting for. It is the third episode. By the way, my name is Megdo Siema, and today in the studio, I've got two gentlemen, both of which are my colleagues on and off the show, both of which are my companions on and off the show, and I must confess they are both my alter egos on and off the show. On my far right, I've got a man whom I consider to be the epicenter of both outspokenness and self-will. He is the author of Spontaneity and Ingenuity. He is Mwagu Jacob Komola. And I can imagine some of you sitting at home a little bit dumbfounded with the gentleman on my immediate right. I consider him to be a basket of both spirituality and intellectuality. Those who have been around him will tell you of his extraordinary eloquence and his sense of demeanor and humanity. He is Mihaly Franz. Today we're going to be communicating more or focusing more on the importance of communication within nuclear families, between parents and their children, and how that can be attributed or linked to the scourge or the pandemic of gender-based violence and other domestic violence examples. Gentlemen, here we are again. I will start with you, Mr. Mihaly. I would like to pose this question, which I so believe it is suitable and pertinent for starting it off. What is communication?
What a beautiful introduction. Okay, communication, usually you have to dissect it. What is a communication? It's when two people communicate in a certain context. Communicate about what? And we have different kinds of communication. The first one, we have intrapersonal communication. We have interpersonal communication. We have small group communication. We have a mass communication. Then intrapersonal communication is communication which occurs internally. Then interpersonal communication is communication which occurs between two people. And small group communication is a communication which occurs more than 3 and upwards. And mass group communication is actually when a speaker communicates with an entire congregation. It's more than 12 when we're going there. So that's how communication can be dissected. And also you need to check its fundamental core within the society, both internally at home, both outside when you take within the society. But the most important thing that you need to do, they usually say charity begins at home. Then you can pose a question or no, charity begins at home where? Actually, charity begins internally. Interpersonal communication is the most important communication that you need to master before you can be able to master the interpersonal communication. Because interpersonal communication goes hand in hand with the self-concept, the opinions, the beliefs, the attitudes that you hold internally, you believe to be true. But at the end, when you utter them or when you vocalize them within the public domain, you want them to be heard. So you need to check how communication plays a crucial role in all aspects of life.
Well, I think you put it very well there, but I don't know because I've heard someone saying there's a difference between someone who's talking to you and someone who's talking at you. But I would like to pose this question to Mr. Komola to say, how can we say then that communication can now be attributed to gender-based violence? Because I've heard somewhere that there is a link between the lack of communication and families which are more probable or susceptible to be engaged in domestic violence. I don't know, Mr. Komola, if you can comment on this.
Thank you, South Africans, for having us today. We hope you'll be watching this show throughout till the end and commenting there on the comment section. Today, we are very privileged to have a new member who's joining us and who will be with us throughout the episodes of the Human in It. And today's third episode, we are actually talking about the importance of communication, how we communicate about gender-based violence, and how we actually spread the message and raise awareness about gender-based violence. Mr. Siema, they're posing such a beautiful question, and it is very important that we understand that our opinions actually contribute to how we communicate about gender-based violence. For example, I've heard some people communicating about an incident of a woman who had been raped. And one of the things that I've noticed about that conversation was that the first thing that they asked when they heard that a woman has been raped was, what was she wearing? Which raised a question to me that what are these people actually thinking? Are they blaming the woman of actually being raped, or are they actually blaming the perpetrator for raping the woman? And actually we've noticed throughout the years that when someone has been raped, the blame is actually being put on the victim, which actually makes it very hard for the victim to actually do what? To report the case, which there's this stigma that is attached to being raped, that women actually feel bad for being raped, that they actually feel ashamed to come out and say, I've been raped, and report the case of violence that has been bestowed on them. So we're actually today we'll be focusing on that and saying, let's change how we communicate, let's change our beliefs, and let's change how we actually talk about gender-based violence, and let's put blame where blame is supposed to be put.
Of course, well, I don't think that the stigma which we are dealing with, it is something that can be considered with minor attention, because I think the stigma is almost everywhere with regard to domestic violence, gender-based violence, and anything else that we have succumbed to as a society, either social, psychological, or otherwise. But the other question, or one other question which I would like to pose to one of you gentlemen, is the question of, let's say, lockdown, which many believes that has confined many families into one space, and as a result of that, a large amount of cases regarding gender-based violence has been reported. So I want to know, Mr. Mihal, can we now say that the confinement or the claustrophobic environment which families find themselves in one space has now caused, or it can be partly blamed to some of the rises in cases of gender-based violence?
Actually, in terms of communication, as now maybe people can say what actually causes gender-based violence within the lockdown space. Then you can ask yourself, a lot of people, if you can check in South Africa, they've reported a lot of cases where someone who has been confined in a certain space, not consuming alcohol, that thing led to gender-based violence. If someone maybe not getting enough money, it led to gender-based violence. Then you start to ask yourself, what is going on? What is life in the midst of COVID-19? What is life in the midst of lockdown? What is life in the midst of materialistic accumulation? So then now you have to check and narrow it down. You check the materialistic accumulation, you check lockdown, you check gender-based violence. And at the end, someone tells you, actually, the confined space in absentia of materialistic accumulation led to gender-based violence. Then now you ask yourself, in terms of a perpetrator who actually was involved in the gender-based violence, if you allow yourself to be determined by materialistic accumulation, you will have a problem, because we should be able to define you in absentia of materialistic accumulation. You can't say lockdown actually led to gender-based violence. It's you maybe having a psychological problem, having a physical problem. Someone maybe, if somehow you know that you used to enjoy yourself outside the family, and now it's your time for you to sit down with your family and communicate with your family, and those aspects of life, you don't have them because you've never had a time to deal with them. And for now you are facing the reality, and when you face the reality, you want to deal with the gender-based violence, abuse women, abuse children in a home state because of lockdown. We should not actually hide behind lockdown. We should check gender-based violence on its own and check your problem. I have never seen a man who grows without acknowledging his own mistake. I've never seen a man who grows without seeing that he has a problem. First and foremost, before someone can notice that you have a problem, on your own you have to check, actually, I have this problem, I need to deal with. Because if myself, I say, you have a problem without you tracing it, it it might be another scandal to deal with, but lockdown has got little to do with gender-based violence. Actually, the causal agent of gender-based violence, it has to do with the inner being of a person, the psychological part, because the manner in which you view things affects also your understanding. Then your understanding influences the reality in your own space of time.
Well, I think you put it very well there to say we can't just blame the lockdown because everyone, almost everyone, I've searched on those cases, some of the victims or some of the perpetrators rather, they are blaming the lockdown, but you would see that in some of those instances, the lockdown cannot at all be blamed, but they're just putting it as a scapegoat to sort of manifest or sort of try to hide the real reasons why that could be the case. So I would like to pose this question to Mr. Komola to say, since domestic violence and its example, gender-based violence, has become the scourge of this nation, what do you think should be the platforms or the institutions which can be created to deal with gender-based violence or to teach people how to communicate? Because communication itself can also be linked to some of the cases of gender-based violence. The lack of communication causing friction within families, ineffective communication causing physical fights, and so on within families. How can we create, or what type of institutions can be created to try to educate people on how to speak?
Right, thank you, colleague. I'd like to mention this to you, South Africans, that over time and over the years, there have been many institutions that have been created around the concept of gender-based violence and laws, and that did not decrease the number of cases that were occurring in these days or in these countries. Therefore, I'm actually saying to the South Africans that we actually need to do one thing, and that is acknowledge that we have this surge in cases of gender-based violence, and we have this pandemic, and deal with it. And how can we deal with it? Obviously, the only way to deal with it is if we accept it and say now is the time to act against it. How can we act? The only thing that we can do is communicate about it. And when you communicate gender-based violence to your neighbor, when you communicate gender-based violence to your family, you're actually raising awareness about it and saying this is not okay, because now many people who have actually been victimized through gender-based violence, they're actually scared to report it, or they actually even think that gender-based violence on its own is actually not a crime, or it's actually not even an act of violence against you. They actually think that this is the right that men have. They have the right to actually perpetrate them or actually abuse them. So I would like to mention these different types of acts which fall within the gender-based violence that the Council of Europe has actually identified. It says violence within the family or domestic violence. That means that is violence that is occurring in the family. That is rape and sexual violence. It can happen in a marriage. It can happen within the spouses. It can happen in or anywhere in public. Then we have sexual harassment that can happen in the workplace or anywhere. Then we have violence in institutionalized environments. Then we have feminine genital mutilation. Then we have forced marriages, violence in conflict and post-conflict situations. We have killings in the name of honor. Then we have failure to respect freedom of choice, and with regard to reproduction, that can be forced abortion. Therefore, I'd like to mention to South Africans that the only way we can deal with gender-based violence is actually by communicating it and teaching our children, teaching our neighbors that gender-based violence is actually not a right thing. It is actually a violence, it is a crime, and we need to report it. And when we communicate gender-based violence, let's be sensitive and actually let's accept that this thing is a crime on its own. Then that's the only way we can win the fight against gender-based violence, without actually creating institutions, because institutions are there and the cases are still increasing. For example, we have countries which have the strictest laws, and even in those countries we will find that the perpetrators or the cases are increasing. Therefore, the only way we can do it is just raise awareness and teach our boys and teach our girls that this thing is a crime.
Well, I believe you've heard it yourself there, that the institutions are already there, but the question is, are they effective? are they trying to curb or curtail the rising scourge of gender-based violence? So it's a question that you yourself at home, you can also ask yourself and try to answer it on our comment section. But anyway, I would also like to ask Mr. Mihali here to say, in African setups, in African culture, it has been viewed, observantly so, even when we were young, that African males have got sort of a communication gap between them and their children, regardless of gender. So I want to know, and I would hope someone at home, sitting at home, would like to ask this question to say, can we say there is a relationship between how African males are raised and how they sort of attribute or attain a stage of ineffective communication towards their children when they are male in a homestead?
Actually, you know, sometimes people, we used to blame circumstances. When a man caught involved in a gender-based violence, somehow someone might tell you, actually, the manner in which I was raised, I was not raised well. My father was an abusive man. My mom did this. Maybe my siblings did this. But for now, you can't, if you see that the circumstance is not good, you have to change the circumstance. You have to deal with yourself. If, for instance, me, for example, I was raised in an abusive family, I should determine what kind of a man I want to be. And if I have seen or spotted that actually the communication was a serious problem in my family, I must now, when I grow, say, no, me and my wife and my kids, we need to sit down, we need to communicate, because communication is pivotal key within the family. My children need to be taught about this. Mr. Komora said something earlier on when he was talking and mentioning those aspects there noted down by Europe. But if you check, when this thing revolves around, do people communicate? He was saying something about a communication about gender-based violence, how we communicate gender-based violence. How do you communicate about it? You say maybe in an African perspective, they say a man should cry internally. Unfortunately, sometimes because women get hurt by a man. Maybe children are in a state of problem. But communication, the manner in which you communicate about GBV, speak to the mind of the people. If you get your communication wrong, everything will be wrong, will be messed up. Because someone will believe what you've said, actually, it's a right, even if it's a wrong, because of the communication, because of the information that you've given them, because information is power, it's a key. But you should never, ever, as a man, blame your circumstance. Change that circumstance. If you're not coming from a rich family, the richness must come from you. You determine what kind of individual you want to be at the end. But if you attach your mindset in a power of ignorance, you'll continue blaming it, you'll continue blaming it, and the very same mistake perpetuates itself over and over again without being solved, because there is no one who wants to rise and deal with this and change this circumstance.
Well, I think you put it very well, almost endorsing the words of Mr. Komola in the previous show, saying that we have the power to change our attitude. And I believe with great exactitude with these issues, and as the youth combining together, we can deal with some of these issues. And now I would like us gentlemen to shift a little bit from communication to go to the circumstances of gender-based violence, especially on an individual level, maybe psychological, economical, lack of self-confidence, self-esteem, and whatever. What can be said with regard to some of these consequences, like lack of self-esteem and so on? Can such behaviors or such conditions be related to gender-based violence, which one have succumbed in their homes or with their partners or wherever they may have met such situations or such abuses?
Yeah, I think you are apparent. Earlier on I was reading this book by Peter James stating, "You are dead." There was this young man who killed a girl at a very tender age because the girl refused to sleep with him, and the girl's hair was in brownish color. So that thing, it kept on growing inside of him. When he see a girl with a brownish hair, he was just killing up and down, killing up and down. So in terms of issue, lack of self-esteem, sometimes it leads to that. You know, when you don't vocalize what is eating you, sometimes I might not see what is actually going on inside of yourself because you don't voice it out. That's why we need to narrow it down to such an extent where we actually communicate. Just feel free to communicate. If you have lack of self-confidence, you must need help instead of maybe trying to cover it by abusing Mr. Komora and all those stuff. And the mindset, you know, the mind is the most powerful tool. Whatever's going on in your mind, at the end, it becomes manifested. So if you have something and you know that thing it's a weak point, you need to say it so that you can be able to deal with it. Don't actually defend what defeats you.
Well, mentioning the mind there, and you're taking me to some of the words said by Napoleon Hill. He said, most gold has been mined in the minds of individuals, that it has been taken from the earth. But anyway, I would like to pose this question to Mr. Komala regarding self-image. Since you've answered regarding self-esteem and self-confidence, I would like to take this one of self-image to Mr. Komala to say, can the lack of self-image in one individual be attributed or linked to gender-based violence, which they have succumbed as children in the homesteads or wherever they may have came across it? Can such behavior or condition of lack or poor self-image be linked to domestic violence?
All right, thank you, colleague. About self-image, you will have to understand that self-image is a broad concept, and therefore, when you're talking about it in the concept of gender-based violence, we have to bring it into the victim side and say that, for instance, when a victim has been victimized, we'll have to understand that in different cultures, they'll do what? What they'll do, firstly, they'll look at the norms that are there, that are put in place in that culture. Some cultures may shame the victim and say that he has brought shame into the family, and they might practice what? They might practice honor killing, they might kill their victim, or they might say what? The perpetrator is expected to marry the victim as an act of honor on actually restoring the family of the victim's dignity. Therefore, you should realize what that whole process is actually doing to the victim. The victim is obviously never going to find peace. How can you find peace when you're married to someone who's raped you? You will have to understand how that actually is going to attribute to the victim's psychological effect throughout her lifetime. And you have to understand that you're actually jailing the victim. You're actually limiting his you're actually limiting the victim's abilities to actually spread out. And therefore, you have to understand that self-image is actually a big concept, and we cannot just talk about it in the concept of just say the victim's side. We have to actually look at it in a broader way and say, how can this concept actually contribute to someone actually bestowing the act of gender-based violence? Therefore, I'll have to say that you know what, you cannot just blame something that is actually controllable, or say because of this I'm doing that. It is, first of all, you have to understand that when you are acting or practicing gender-based violence on women, you will have to understand that that thing on its own is actually a decision that you have took. It's not because of a lack of that and lack of that and lack of that. You are taking that decision on yourself. Therefore, we cannot just say it's because of self-image that the person has actually bestowed an act of gender-based violence.
Well, I think you've had it very well, you've captured it very well. And one thing I can take from your statement is to say culture can sometimes be blamed for some of these killings, some of these femicides, which we experience almost on daily television. And I think researchers have shown that in communities whereby culture of men abusing women is treated as a norm, those communities are actually the epicenter of gender-based violence. Anyone who wants to add anything?
Yes, and I think that's going to be enough for today. We're hoping to see your comments and ideas on how we can actually bring an end to gender-based violence in South Africa. There by the comment section, just hit there and subscribe. Colleague.
Thank you.